All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another discussion of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. In this case, Dr. A.P. Canavan and I will be discussing Toll the Hounds. And AP, if you have a nicer, oh yeah, it's right there next to you, because I have this hardcover edition that was missing its dust jacket when I bought it. So sorry, apologies for that, everyone. But AP has the nice looking one there. And yeah, we're going to be discussing, this is the non-spoiler discussion, no spoilers of Toll the Hounds. We're doing this today on my channel, but we will be having, as usual, a spoiler-filled discussion. Actually, scratch that. We're going to be having several spoiler-filled discussions because there is just so much to talk about with this rich, incredible book, Toll the Hounds. We just don't think we can do it in one single session, right, AP?
Exactly right. Philip, good to see you again. It's good to be talking about this. This is such, for me, it's an absolutely incredible book. Yeah. And I know not all readers feel that way, but then again, not all readers feel that way about any book. It's you can't have a book that is universally loved. But this is absolutely incredible. And it is rare that I am so effusive with my praise. But Toll the Hounds is an incredibly special book, not only for me for personal reasons,
right,
but the writing in it, the themes explored, the depth of emotion to it, the complexity of interweaving plot elements. It almost, like, for me, this is one of the, I suppose, to use an internet, it's peak fiction or peak fantasy. But that's how I feel about it. I think it's an incredible book. And while I don't play favorites really with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, it is just so astounding. And it's one of the few that I actually have difficulty discussing elements as easily as the others, because it's so hard to find those fracture points to sort of insert critical tools to break things apart, to pull out the bits and pieces, have a look at them and put them back. There's something about this that it is almost seamless in a lot of respects in terms of what's going on, because the interconnectedness of theme, of story threads, of plot, i.e. the narrative events as they occur, right. Characters, the events themselves, everything about this is so heavily linked and interconnected that it becomes incredibly difficult to tease it apart.
Yeah, it's rich. It is incredibly rich. And it is one of those reads where I can look back to some of the books that have had the greatest impact on me personally. And when I get to the end of the book, it's a very special feeling. I guess that's catharsis, right? When you read those last words and you close the book and you're just sitting there with a sense of awe, a sense of touching the sublime. And then for weeks afterwards, you're still you're feeling this sense of elevation, and it's just quite incredible. And that is something I felt when reading this book. It was a book that I couldn't read quickly either. I wanted to take this one a bit slower, and I'm glad I did, because I feel like I've absorbed it in a way, and that's just incredible. But there's so much to talk about, and we're going to do this in a non-spoiler way. But some of the things we want to highlight include, let's begin with the narrative structure of this, because it is unique among the 10 books of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, in that it has a frame narrative. And we are being told the story, and we have an interesting narrative perspective in here, told by a character who is within the story as well. So there's just a lot of richness in terms of that, and that is linked to the prose and other matters that we need to discuss a little bit here, right?
Right. I have to take exception to the point that you've just made.
Okay, let's hear that then.
The entire Malazan Book of the Fallen is set within a frame narrative.
Right.
So not just this book. This has the most explicit internal frame narrative of any of the other books. But even Midnight Tides, it's implied that that is also being framed by one of the earlier books because of a narrative event in the
True.
preceding book.
That troll is telling the story. That's true.
So I take exception that this is the only book that has a frame narrative. The entire Malazan Book of the Fallen is within a frame narrative.
Yeah.
And it's happened in other points in the series. So while I agree, it has the most explicit, and this is where, I talk about diegetic levels and things like that.
Oh yeah, that's very useful for this, by the way. So if you don't mind, just quickly define the terms before you use them for people who might not be familiar with them.
Okay, if you think of the diegesis, and we'll use a very simplified model for this. The diegesis is the main narrative level where the narrative occurs. A level above that would be the metadiegetic level. The level below that would be the hypodiegetic level. And you can then go above it again, which would be meta-metadiegetic. You can go below again, which would be hypodiegetic, and so on. You can extend them both ways.
Right.
And the reason we talk about this is if you take a frame narrative, so the very first page of a book, someone is the never-ending story. Remember the film of the never-ending story where Peter Falk is reading the story to Fred Savage?
Right.
Oh no, Princess Bride. That's what I'm thinking of. Princess Bride.
Yeah.
And so the story opens and it's a grandfather reading a story to his son. There's your frame narrative. And you could say that's the diegetic level. Because that's where the story starts.
Right.
But then we move into what's actually happening in the Princess Bride. Like we see Wesley and Princess Buttercup.
That's the story within the story.
And it's a story within a story. It's a nested story, like the Russian dolls. It's a story within a story. So we could say that the Fred Savage, Peter Falk, the grandfather and grandson, that is the diegetic level. And then the story of Buttercup and Wesley and everything goes on is the hypodiegetic level.
Right. Inside. Yeah. Okay.
Inside. Or we could, because the majority of the story is actually Wesley and Princess Buttercup and everything that goes on, you go, that's the main diegetic level, in which case the frame narrative we consign to the metadiegetic level. It is above it.
Okay.
And they don't interact.
Perfect. So let's not get too meta or hypo here.
So
yeah,
if you think of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the 10-book series, as one narrative, let's call that the diegesis.
Okay.
It's actually framed by a frame narrative, which we could then say is the metadiegetic level. So it's a frame around the story.
Right.
Or we can, and then when we get to Toll the Hounds, there's a story also being told.
Yes.
So this is where it gets kind of complicated, because you
layers here. Yeah.
You start talking about different layers, and there's different ways to frame it. So that's kind of what I mean by about these diegetic levels and about frame narratives, and about using this as a way to kind of recontextualize how you're thinking about the depth of the narrative structure, as opposed to thinking of page 1 is the same as page 100, that they're all on the same level. There are different levels within narrative that you can talk about.
Yeah. So Toll the Hounds has the most explicit frame narrative in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, among the books, at least the most immediately obvious, because you get the frame narrator from the beginning, and also inserting himself into the story as it proceeds. So at many points along the way, this frame narrator intrudes, right? Speaks directly to the reader. So is that a unique feature of in the series? Perhaps, but that affects the prose, and it affects the tone of this book in some interesting ways. It's interesting because of its themes, but it is very playful in a sense. Even though it is a very serious book, it is also at the same time very playful, isn't it? Because of this frame narrator.
Yeah, and this is a style of narration that actually has fallen out of favor quite a lot. The idea of a narrator having a character voice that is very strong and powerful, having a very identifiable voice that affects the actual words on the page, the choice of lexicon.
I think of Chaucer, of course. I think of Canterbury Tales. That's where my head goes. Yeah.
And also making commentary about things, where the narrator is actually speaking to the audience.
Yeah.
That this is a style of narration. It used to happen quite a lot, and yet it's fallen out of favor because one of the modern sort of styles that's much more popular is a very clear narrative style, as if you are just watching a film, and the narrator is not going to comment on it. Now, obviously, that there are variants on that. There's different ways that you can color or texture that window that you're watching the world through.
Yeah.
But to have a very explicit narrator comment on the things that they are narrating, and in a very distinctive voice, is not as common anymore as it used to be.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you typically these days, then in that case, you would have fewer diegetic levels in most.
Not necessarily, because you can have, well, a character talking to another character can tell them a story, which is a story
within the story. Yeah, true. So, okay, cool. So, along with this narrative perspective, we do get a style of prose that is different, that is distinct, I think, from. And Erikson has such range. I mean, the guy can write with so many different styles. But this one is distinctive, I think, from the rest of the series. Would you agree with that?
Okay, and on this occasion, I will agree.
There, I got you.
And we've seen this before in all of the books, and I've had videos on this. We've discussed it before, that the style of prose that Erikson used is very much modeled after short story writing, where you have words on the page are doing more than just telling you the surface level.
Right.
That there's actually usually a lot more going on beneath it. But here, there's a lot of very overt, symbolic and metaphorical language being used very explicitly. The constructions are very explicitly these things. So it's, in some respects, it's the same technique that Erikson has used in the past, but because of the narrative voice, because of this very distinct narrator, what they are doing is far more explicit, more overt, and therefore it feels more, say, poetic, or using these poetic devices more explicitly. So where in the past there would have been, say, a description of a tree on a hill, and if you're paying attention to the language and actually digging into the language, you can see a lot of the techniques. Here, it is overt. The narrator is explicitly going, and this tree, and using a simile or using a metaphor and building all of those things out. And the thing is, the covert stuff is still happening.
Right.
So that's why the language in this is so wonderfully complex and deep and rich. And that's why it's harder in some respects to pick apart.
But it also enables the symbolism that you're referring to, enables Erikson, through the narrator, to create lots of links, doesn't it? And parallels, and also delve into the idea of the reliability of memory, because this is something that Erikson does anyway, but he's allowed himself to do it on a much more intricate level, I think, in Told the Hounds. And again, it goes back to this narrative perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think the big thing that this particular style of narration does is it makes this book feel a lot more personal, because the reader is being brought into a conversation where the narrator is telling the reader a story. There's a level of connection that we feel here that you don't get when we have levels of connection when we read. Don't misunderstand that. Right. But someone telling you a story can feel a lot more personal. And I know people don't always enjoy this, but I think that's what's going on here. And it seems to work so neatly in connection with a lot of the themes that are being explored.
Yes. And speaking of themes, this, of course, you and I had the pleasure of speaking to Steven Erikson when we were halfway through the series, and I asked him about themes, and he mentioned how that's where he starts. He begins with theme, and builds things around it. And he had that wonderful metaphor about the mound on the ground and all of that. I feel as if Toll the Hounds is a very theme-driven book, even in the context of Malazan, that is very theme-driven. And you remarked, and I'd like you to elaborate on this if you don't mind, you remarked how the plot is both relevant and irrelevant in this case. So I'd like to give you a chance to elaborate on that.
Because people, if I say that the plot isn't relevant, oh, the story doesn't matter, no, it's not that. In some respects, elements of the story are incredibly important. And
right.
When we think of the repercussions for the Malazan world, the repercussions for the whole of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the events that occur, and this is what people sort of regularly refer to as like this sort of the ending being absolutely unputdownable, and all of these events that occur are so incredibly important for the world.
Such iconic events, huge iconic events within the Malazan series. Often people who are veterans of the series will talk about their favorite moments, and a lot of them are in Toll the Hounds.
And similarly, when they talk about that, they go, yeah, but the whole
oh dear. Now
start of the book, this feeling.
So I lost the connection there. So you were talking about the start of the book. What were you saying then?
Okay, so they, even though that the ending is almost universally, well, that's probably a bit strong, significantly loved for everything that happens.
Yeah.
There are complaints about the start of it being very, very slow and not understanding the relevance of certain plot threads or certain aspects of it. And some of them do not tie up neatly in the climax and the denouement. They don't seem to be relevant. And the reason for this, at least to me, is while all of those narrative events are very, very cool and very interesting and can be very exciting and you get involved in it, what is actually being explored in terms of the themes and relating it on such a personal level to an expression of what is mortality in terms of life and death, in terms of grief and suffering, in terms of family, all of these aspects, these different thematic concerns that are all wrapped up, is such a deeply personal take on the human condition that the narrative events are almost irrelevant, because the core of this is so powerful in terms of its thematic exploration. And yet when we talk about the importance of theme, people go, oh, because nothing interesting happens. If we talk about the importance of events, it's, oh, well, it's all about and that's what I started with by saying, because everything is so deeply connected, it can be difficult to try and separate these things out. So in some respects, the narrative events are almost irrelevant to the feelings, emotions, the philosophies, the attitudes that get explored in the novel.
Right. So the word I think of is transcendence. There's a sense, for me at least here, of somehow what happens here, the themes actually transcend the plot in a way that it feels so just, it's about human experience. And then at a certain point, it's as if the plot, it matters, but it's as if we've transcended it. Do you see what I mean?
And you've rather neatly shown why the two of us discuss things, because I go on for 20 minutes about something, you go, yeah, so I'm thinking of the word transcendence, and that explains what you've just talked about for 20 minutes. The other word that you used earlier that I think is actually perfect for this is sublime.
Yeah.
The highest emotion that the mind can achieve, that the stimulation of both, it's bringing the mind and the soul into sync of something that is achingly poignant, that is devastatingly beautiful. The contradictions of all of this and the power of it, and that's I think a powerful element of this novel.
Yeah, it's as if I feel wounded by the beauty of this book. It's just incredible. Just incredible. So let's talk about some of those themes a little bit more then, because you named a few of them, and I think it's worth revisiting them and perhaps elaborating and then mentioning a few more, because there's a lot here, and we're not going to touch on every single possible theme, I'm sure, but we're going to mention some of the ones that we're thinking about at the moment. So for me, the theme that stuck out the most while reading it this time was grief. And this is a book in which there are so many levels, and I don't think I've ever seen as poignant and thorough an exploration of grief. Whether we're talking about the fantasy genre or outside of it, this is a beautiful piece of literature, and there's loss, and that is portrayed in here. That's very touching. But there's also just a lot about grief and the aftermath of loss, and how we cope with it and how we don't cope with it very well. And I was again reminded of what Stephen Erikson said when he was in a conversation with Claudia. I mentioned this in another discussion of ours, and how he talked about grief as something you'd never actually put down. You just sort of get used to the weight of it and carrying it around, and it becomes part of you. So just a very, very powerful theme in here, grief. I can't say I've ever seen it explored quite so powerfully. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's not to discount other novels that have explored this, but one of the things that makes it so powerful for me is grief is explored in so many different ways within this, from so many different perspectives, that some of them are really resonant with my own personal experience. But then some of them are ways of thinking about grief or encountering grief that I hadn't considered. And that's, to me, very, very powerful to see multiple approaches. And we've seen Erikson do this before with various thematic explorations, multiple perspectives of a thing to try and show its full dimensionality. And with grief can be incredibly personal. And grief quite often is incredibly personal because it's what you feel through loss. But we also have the grief that we feel on behalf of others. We also have a collective grief where we are sharing in an experience. And so much of this, moving from the deeply personal to the grander, broader, more universal scale, that's part of it. But it's also how we can feel loss at something that someone else will not feel loss for. And it's understanding that personal aspect of grief, that how we experience the world is deeply personal, and a lot of that is explored. And that's why I think it keeps coming back to elements of the human condition: what life is, what love is, what death is, what mortality means, what family means.
Yeah, precisely. So yeah, the natural extension, I guess, of grief is, of course, mortality is another looming theme in here. But there's another side to it as well. And there are aspects of Toll the Hounds that are incredibly life affirming as well. There's a lot in here about love and about relationships and how we become devoted to one another, how we find solace in one another. So there's a lot of beauty in that as well. And it's about desire and the desire for life, right? Which is something that survives eventually all the loss and the trauma and the grief. So it's a beautiful thing, and how all these relationships and these life affirming elements are portrayed in here as well.
And again, they're not all portrayed positively, but like any of the thematic explorations, Erikson, once again, he goes, I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to look at it from different angles. I'm going to give you examples of all of these different ways of approaching it. The multiplicity of and complexity of human emotion, the different types of relationships, ranging from love through lust, the positive aspects of that, the negative aspects of that, the fact that love can be extraordinarily supportive and life-affirming, but it can also turn into obsession, and it can destroy. That what we feel personally or are culturally are appropriate ways to love, and this is the standard way that you do it, and then the multiplicity of human relationships that extend far beyond what we personally experience or know, and the complexity of those relationships and different ways of approaching it.
Yeah.
And I think that, without getting into any spoilers, that it is very easy when we read to map our own cultural beliefs, our own morality, our own individual perspective, and go, this is what this should be. And sometimes we close out the fact that the human experience ranges far beyond what we know and what we are comfortable with or what we expect. And when we see relations like that depicted, or when we see relationships that don't correspond to our own perceived norms, they can seem strange or wrong or silly or, well, that's just, and be dismissive.
Yeah.
But I guarantee you, if you look at your broadest group of friends and the people whose lives that you have touched, that there are going to be people there that maybe in private have a completely different conception of what a relationship is compared to our own.
Yeah, there you said it very well. There is such an array of responses to the awareness of our mortality. And not all those responses are healthy. In fact, quite a few of them are not. And Erikson throughout the series actually portrays these responses, but I feel like it's very prominent in Toll the Hounds, that our response to our and it's both a curse and a blessing, this level of consciousness that we have. But it is largely responsible for this array of responses that we have to awareness that we're not always going to be around, and that these bodies that we inhabit are going to perish. And so it's really powerful. And very related to that, I think, is the portrayal of parental relationships in Toll the Hounds. Very powerful aspect of this. Also related to mortality, as many of us are at an age where we're looking at our parents getting older and losing them, and that's it's just an extremely resonant theme, I think, for some of us at times, but very wonderful explorations of parents and children here, and not always positive. There's some real struggle in Toll the Hounds for some of the parent-child relationships in here, and some are beautiful and some show the failure of one party or the other, and the consequences of that failure can be devastating and extremely poignant. So yeah, there's a lot in here about parents, isn't there?
And that familial aspect, and even the aspect of parents and children and family and found family, and broader concepts of family being explored. One of the nice things about this, because the novel is set in an area that we are returning to, Erikson has not forgotten events from earlier books. Things that people went, oh, well, that thread didn't go anywhere. Suddenly, they become much more important here. A number of earlier plot lines and plot threads get brought to the fore here because Erikson never forgot about them. But because he wasn't telling a simple chronological story of 5 heroes going on a quest, the complexity sort of had moved them further down the line. And seeing those relationships be explored, and one of them is deeply bound up in aspects of parent-child relationships, and the complexity of that, where it's not always straightforward. And this is not an aspect that you typically find, this particular one that, and you know the one that I'm referring to, that this relationship is not typically found explored in a lot of epic fantasy.
Yeah.
And it's why a lot of the Malazan Book of the Fallen remains so special, in my estimation, because Erikson doesn't view epic fantasy only has to be in one small box.
Right.
Epic fantasy is just the frame to explore the things that literature has always explored. And I think this book in particular brings a lot of those greater literary sensibilities into the epic fantasy sphere to show readers who maybe have not experienced a lot of the classics or literary fiction, these things are explored in literature, and it's okay to explore them
Oh yeah.
in fantasy.
Yeah, it's so wonderful because we get the full array, the evolution of the child-parent relationship, and often follows a pattern of the very small child worshiping the parent. And I can remember when my older daughter was 4 years old, and one day she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, you're the strongest man in the world, right?" And I said, "Yes, I am." Well, she figured out otherwise eventually. And
Did she figure it out when you just couldn't open that jar, and then your wife came in and went,
now, AP, I'm gonna have to get out my guns here. No, I mean because eventually they get to be teenagers, and they see your flaws, and your flaws are in fact sometimes writ large during those years. And so there is that aspect of the child-parent relationship, the rebellion, the needing to distance oneself and find one's own identity. This is also richly portrayed in various threads in Toll the Hounds. And then, of course, there's the reconciliation with the parent later on, when you understand more fully that the parent is, yes, a flawed human being who is trying, and so you get that full array of worship and rebellion and reconciliation, all portrayed so beautifully in various threads in Toll the Hounds. And I can't wait to talk about some of the more specific aspects of that.
and what you just said, that ties into another thing, obviously, that gets explored, which is elements of redemption and absolution.
Yes.
that get explored, both in a religious sense as well as in a personal sense, and in a very secular way. That it runs the gamut again of exploring the distinction between absolution and redemption.
Yeah.
And it, again, Erikson explores it from multiple angles with multiple threads and multiple characters to show various elements of it. And it never once is didactic, and he hasn't written a screed about it, but
Right.
it allows for this exploration. And again, it's something I appreciate when we see these things from so many different angles, that it helps us gain a greater understanding, tying back into that intellectual exercise that the sublime touches on, but also the beauty of it and the aching poignancy of it and the emotion of it.
Yeah. And so the distinction there between absolution and redemption, just briefly, being absolution is something that comes from without. It is given to one. It is a cleansing that is given to one by some outside source. Whereas redemption is, I think it's a much slightly more complicated matter. And I'm never quite sure, okay, who decides if one is redeemed, but it seems to imply that there is something that must come from the self in order to achieve redemption, that one has to act, that one has to do something, rather than being the passive vessel when it comes to absolution, that comes from without. That's a distinction that is somewhat explored in here as well, right?
Yeah, and I think the way that Erikson explores it is a way that I personally sort of think about it. Absolution can be granted. Absolution is a thing. It's over in and you are absolved. Done. Right. Redemption is a process, and a process does not necessarily ever have to end. That the process, you can be at some point maybe redeemed, and the process is over. But redemption involves the active self, that you need to perform acts, or you need to do something in order to be redeemed. But also it is a process. It is not I've just redeemed you.
Right.
That's not how redemption is explored here. And that, I think, is a very powerful message, that it's not just about, I'm been wiped clean of my sins. It's a tabula rasa moment. It's no, redemption is part of the human process, because we all have sins in our past. We all have black marks against us. Yeah. And you can never remove those. You can't go back in time and erase them. But what you can do is always, in moving forward, not make those mistakes again, try to do better and try to offset the damage that you have done to the world and make it more positive. And that is forward progress and momentum and activity that the self performs. And it may never be done. There may be things that you can never fully compensate for, but you still try. And I think that's an important part of redemption explored in this story.
I agree. And the lack of narrative judgment consistently in Malazan, but especially in Toll the Hounds, is quite incredible too, because none of this is ever presented in a judgmental light, which is quite incredible, because he also incorporates themes like the sins of the past, right? And how they can be revisited on the next generation and the consequences for that generation. It's really quite, it's not entirely unique, of course, but it is something that you often don't see, that lack of judgment. And again, I think back to Chaucer too in that regard. Yeah.
But just to pick up on that for a second, I think some people misunderstand us when we talk about the lack of narrative judgment, because they go, well, that character is clearly evil, or that character is clearly bad. And therefore the narrative is judging them. And in some respects, yes. But what we're kind of trying to articulate here is the narrative gives you a lot of different approaches to things. It is not necessarily saying that, oh, everything can go and just make up your own mind. It's here's a whole sequence of stuff. You're the one that is going to decide about it, and giving the reader space to inhabit that world and to consider it and come to their own position. And it's not an absolute across the whole series that every single element is like that. But Erikson does not generally take absolute positions on things. And quite often when an element is signaled, oh, the bad guys are doing this, or this character is evil and they have done this and this is bad, there are certain things that are always bad, but what he usually presents us with is the complexity of those situations. That and again, going back to one of the relationships, one of the parental relationships that we see as a consequence of something that is bad that happened in a previous book. You go, because you don't just go, oh yeah, it's bad. But there's complexity here. And Erikson doesn't preach about it. He invites an exploration of it.
Precisely. So while you could say that the narrator doesn't judge, that the books don't judge, as you say, there's an invitation for us to explore. And it never does any book say, don't you think about these in terms of your own morality, and these are things, in fact, just the opposite, right? The books are inviting us to think about these very important questions of morality, and perhaps take positions as well. So yeah, it's not absolute relativism, in other words, right?
And again, people talk about the moral relativism or moral objectivism. I go, it's one of two things. And again, when we assume these two positions, if you think on a spectrum, if you had a spectrum of the color red running to the color blue, and so no other colors but just red and blue, because you can do this on a computer, and you start off with 100% red and the other side is 100% blue, when does purple start? Give me the exact moment when purple starts, because if it is when it is 99% red and 1% blue, that's now purple. All the way through to the other side, you go, the absolute positions are usually not where you end up. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. And we see this in the Malazan books, the Fallen, about darkness and light, that shadow is very, very important because it is mutable. It is in the middle. It's where things actually happen and occur. And when we think of it's either, oh, I believe in an objective line, you go, where is the line? Give me the exact line. And then as soon as you do that, then you start thinking of scenarios that you go, well, okay, there has to be some wiggle room in this line. How broad is this line? is the line going to be straight, or is it going to have to curve around this? It gets complicated in the middle. So it's the idea of having a spectrum of movement between absolute binary positions and thinking of that shifting movement in the middle. And I think that's a lot of what Erikson tries to explore.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely agree. And another facet of that exploration, I think, and a theme that we see in Toll the Hounds in a very important way is personal responsibility versus social responsibility. Would you agree with that one?
Yeah, and that the response of who you have to be to yourself, your own personal responsibility for your life and what you do. But as Donne basically said, no man is an island unto himself, that we are also part of a society, that society is part of a culture, that culture is part of a country. There are interactions with people all over, that what we see here, and you see it in microcosm in terms of found family, of what we do, our relationships, how the personal can spiral out broader than ourselves. And it can have ramifications. And in this instance, as is explored, ramifications for the world.
Right.
So it goes from the intensely personal that affects, you think, only yourself, to affecting the world. And it's all part of that same spectrum of responsibility and relationship.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite aspects of the Malazan books, and I've talked about it before, but this sense of connection and the exploration of identity as, yes, on an individual level, this ego, but also transcending, to use the word again, transcending the self, transcending the ego, to realize one's connection with the broader society, with the world around one. And there's an environmental aspect to this as well, which is very relevant in the Malazan context. But that idea that we are not islands, that we are connected to the people around us, and that, in a sense, seeing oneself in the other. And that is something that I find so beautiful. And there are so many just powerful examples of that happening in the Malazan series. And that is one of my very favorite things about it. Very, very moving. Well, we've done a pretty good job on these themes, I think. Is there anything else that you want to bring up before we wrap up our non-spoiler discussion?
No, I think we've covered the vast majority of the things that we wanted to talk about in a non-spoiler talk, because if you haven't read it, the style of narration, the prose, the voice that the story is told in is very different to the other books. Yeah. That has a knock-on effect about how things are explored, and it changes the feeling of a lot of these things. Mm-hmm. I think we covered that the themes in this are both sometimes more explicit, but also far more covert than in some of the previous books. Yeah. That there are tumultuous world-shaping events in this, because that's something we don't generally focus on when we talk about it. But the narrative events here are some of the most important in terms of the reality of the Malazan world. The repercussions of what happens in this book shapes the entire reality of the Malazan world. Yeah. And we don't generally focus on that, but it's I think it's worth bearing in mind.
It almost feels like the end of a series in a way, except that there are other threads out there that we want resolution to, but this feels like it's such a monumental book that it feels like the end of a series. I don't know if I'm the only person who feels that way, but there is just some major important threads that are come to an incredible climax here. So I don't know, but I know there's more to come, and I'm looking forward to those. But it felt like I finished something very important when I got to the end of this. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. This is for me the power of literature. And it can be any book, because obviously books are very personal to how we respond to them. But certain books speak to us on a level that, and we saw it with, say, like Dead House Gates, and how cathartic aspects of Dead House Gates could be. Yeah. but sometimes they go to the core of who we are, and it strikes a resonance. And if you ever, you know, have looked at anything about like resonance, but almost shaking something apart because that natural resonance is found, and it causes the vibrations to get bigger as the sort of the waves come together and expand rather than canceling each other out. And so certain books strike a chord within us that is so deeply personal that it can almost shake us to our core. And for some people, I think Toll the Hounds is that book.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yep, for some people, yeah. And I know it's an incredibly personal book for you as well, for loads of reasons. And I'm just so glad that we had the chance to read it. And I'm so glad that I have the incredible opportunity to discuss it with you, AP. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on to discuss this. And once again, thank you to your viewers for putting up with me.
I think they're pretty happy to do that. So, all right, my friend, thank you so much. And bye, everyone. And we will see you over on A Critical Dragon, AP's channel. We're going to have lots more to come on Toll the Hounds. So bye, everyone.